started.
All right, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Scott Rasmussen. I'm the president of Lauber Business Partners, and welcome to our panel presentation today on to be remote or not to be remote. That is the question. This somewhat whimsical hijacking of a Shakespearean phrase reflects a much deeper, more important question that's facing every organization's leader today. The pandemic has brought about a unique, tailored approach to the traditional employment model. While previously, other than external salespeople or other outside employees, most employees and employers were used to people coming into the office and doing their jobs. With the pandemic, this all changed, and we've all had to figure it out and respond accordingly. In some ways, remote working has been very difficult, but in other ways, there have been some interesting positives that have come out of it. Now, out of the dilemma that leaders are facing is, as we move out of this, what do we do now? Do we call everybody back? Or perhaps do we find a new hybrid model somewhere in between? Our purpose at Lauber Business Partners is to bring experienced professionals to organizations to help solve business challenges and achieve our clients' organizational goals. Periods of change are what we excel in, and I'm very pleased to provide a couple of our Lauber experts, as well as a client and an employment attorney, to help provide their perspectives to this important change that we're all facing today. So I'd like to now introduce each of our panelists, and they are on at least the side of my screen. And I'm going to actually do it in the order that's on the PowerPoint here. First of all, I'd like to introduce Jennifer Walthers. Jennifer is an attorney and has been practicing law for over 30 years with the firm of Mawicke Goisman. She focuses on helping employers in all legal aspects of the employee relationship, and when necessary, she helps defend employers facing employment-related claims. Secondly, I'd like to introduce Kathy Armbruster, SPHR. Kathy has been with Lauber Business Partners for a little over a year, and she brings over 20 years of experience working at companies like NML, Appleton Papers, and Plexus. She currently serves in a fractional human resource partner role at a number of Lauber business clients. Thirdly, I'm bringing a business owner and leader's perspective to how to effectively keep a business running during the pandemic while protecting employees, is Jerry Voors from Arrow Cabinets. Arrow is the leading supplier of sewing and craft furniture to dealers and internet sites across the country. Jerry has been president for 15 years and is a 50% shareholder of the company. And last but not least is Jane Schroeder, the coaching practice leader at Lauber. Jane joined Lauber over a year ago to build the coaching practice for us. Prior to that, she had her own coaching business for over 20 years. She focuses on leadership and team development solutions using emotional intelligence and positive psychology. So with that, let's get started. That's the rest of our panelists. Should have clicked that a little while ago. To begin with, I'd like to start, and I'm going to stop sharing here for a moment. There we go. With Jerry, and I'd like to get a business owner's perspective. Jerry, like most leaders, you've had to deal with a full arc of the impact that COVID pandemic had on your business. Can you give us a brief storyline of the journey you've wrestled with and some of the key decisions you've had to make throughout this process?
Absolutely. Thanks, Scott. It really is incredible that it's been a full year since we were shutting down and all of us were figuring out cash flow projections, how long we could survive without any revenue. But within 2 weeks, we brought back a skeleton crew in our warehouse while the majority of our 30 employees continued to work remotely. From there, it was kind of off to the races because our business was sewing furniture. Everybody was sitting at home making masks, and we had a lot to do. We had to learn to hire and train remotely, something we absolutely had never done. I've got 2 employees that I still have never met, or at least not met in person. A dramatic change for a guy who historically felt that anybody working from home was sitting at home watching Oprah and doing the laundry. So it was a massive change for me to go that way. Overall, it's worked really well. It helped for us that we were a little bit ahead of the curve in setting up home computers and VPN connections. So when the shutdown happened, we at least had some response. And I think that's a lesson we can learn as we go forward. Our team has generally embraced Zoom meetings, just like this. We invested in the technology and the people for virtual consumer and wholesale trade shows. So we're doing a lot on camera. And for those who return to the office, we enforced face masks, social distancing, installed hand sanitizers, and then we outsourced some of the highest risk activities like unloading floor-loaded containers where people would be inside a confined space for 2 hours. We stressed a positive attitude and cooperation, part of our culture. So looking back, it worked pretty well. It wasn't until Christmas that we finally moved from hair on fire to just really busy, but overall the experience has been really positive for us.
So as you're sitting here today, Jerry, what are you weighing in terms of whether to bring people back and really how to handle some of these? We'll kind of touch on some other issues as we go through it, but where are you sitting right now in terms of moving forward, and what are the things you're weighing?
Well, we're trying to learn the same way that we did last March when we saw China shutting down, that we knew it was going to become. So it's obvious we aren't going to return to the same world we left last March. Remote working revealed benefits, not just for the employees, but for us. It helped our bottom line. Working from home, Zoom sales calls. We used to have 3 or 4 people who were traveling around the country, visiting dealers and doing trade shows. That's $1,000, $2,000 a week that we save for it. So we're still learning how to embrace those changes for the long term, and we'll obviously get back to some of it, but there's benefits that are good for the employees and good for us. And then it's still going to be a few more weeks before we really get to whatever the new normal is in our lives. But for us, it's discussing and planning it now. It seems like every day we've got somebody coming up with a new question that we didn't think about.
All right, thanks, Jerry. I'm going to pivot now into the legal world and call upon Jennifer. There's a lot going on there, and I think from an owner's perspective, in some ways, it's as an attorney, you must love some of this period because it's almost being invented as we go along here. And to the extent you're creative, as I know you are, and thinking and a problem solver, this has to be very interesting. So why don't you take it away, and I'm going to pop a screen up here to maybe guide some of the conversation we're going to have here.
Right. We certainly, in my line of work, we have really had a lot to learn on the fly and to digest a lot of new laws and new information and pass those on to employers very quickly. I'm seeing sort of a number of very common questions amongst clients about the whole issue about, do we return employees to work? And if so, what are the parameters of doing that? And the first question that comes up is, can an employee refuse to return to work? And the general answer is no. The employer has the right to determine where do they want the work to be performed and to require employees to perform it in that location. There's going to be 2 exceptions to that. One is going to be under the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA. That's going to require us to determine whether an employee has a disability that we may be required to accommodate through a remote working arrangement. There are many medical conditions that in and of themselves may not be disabling, meaning preventing employees from working. However, when you combine those medical conditions with potential exposure to COVID, then that can create a disabling condition. So we need to evaluate those situations each individually. Remember that fear of the disease itself is not a disability. Fear of bringing it home and spreading it to your friends or your family is not a disability. There has to be an actual medical condition that impairs the employee. And so if that comes up, it's going to require the employer to at least have a dialogue with the employee to determine whether remote working is in fact a required accommodation. The other instance where it's potential that employees could refuse to return to work has to do with workplace safety surrounding the laws regulated by OSHA. So OSHA has a whole bunch of recommendations for what employers should be doing when employees are working together in this COVID environment. It's not the law, it's just recommendations, and we've heard them all. It has to do with masks and maintaining distance and having physical barriers. If an employee believes that the employer is not satisfying its safety obligations, then the employee may have the right to refuse to return to work under those circumstances. And if we were to discipline or terminate the employee for that refusal, we could be in trouble with OSHA. So we'll just have to pay attention to what are the reasons an employee might be refusing to return to work. We're also then hearing the question about what steps can an employer legally take when the employees return to work? Can we ask employees about their symptoms? Can we ask them about their exposure to COVID? And yes, we can. We can ask them if they've had these specific COVID symptoms. We can ask them if they've had exposure to COVID. We can't ask them if their family member has had COVID, but if we ask the simple question, have you been exposed to anybody who has been tested positive for COVID, we're allowed to answer that question. We're allowed to take temperatures of employees so that we can determine, that's been one of the determining factors to determine whether somebody has COVID. And then we're allowed to require the employees to take a test for COVID. The follow-up question to that has to do with requiring vaccinations. Are we allowed to require employees to have a COVID vaccine? And I'll tell you, unfortunately, the answer is a little bit ambiguous, and it sort of depends on what law you're looking at. The EEOC, which is the federal agency that regulates the anti-discrimination laws, basically is okay with an employer mandating vaccines as long as you make exceptions for employees with disabilities or employees who have religious exceptions. So we just need to determine whether there's other accommodations we can make for people in those circumstances. However, the FDA, which is the agency that has authorized the current COVID vaccines, has authorized them under an emergency use authorization. And that law says that people should have the right to consent to the vaccine, which has suggested to some legal scholars that employees then therefore have the right to decline it. And it's just not been addressed by the courts. So we don't know how that's going to turn out. Meanwhile, in Wisconsin, the state legislature has proposed a bill that would prohibit Wisconsin employers from mandating COVID vaccines for their employees. That's been going through various committees and hearings. And so that's still percolating through the system. And I think there's a chance that that's going to pass. So at least for your Wisconsin employees, you would not be able to require them to get the COVID vaccine. But if we don't require the COVID vaccine, the secondary question is, can we ask the employees for proof or verification as to whether they've had the vaccine? And we can do that as long as we maintain that information confidentially. So we can't disclose to the entire workforce who has and hasn't been vaccinated, but for our own purposes, we can ask for that information. We've been seeing a lot of questions associated with how we're going to pay employees who are working remotely, and we can discuss the details of those. I think we'll come up with that a little bit later, but that certainly is an important question to address. And then there's been a lot of questions about liability waivers. Can we get employees to sign liability waivers? Generally speaking, those probably aren't enforceable. It is the case that in Wisconsin, we now have a law that's became effective March 1st that renders businesses immune from civil liability for any illness or injury related to exposure to COVID. Now, that's not going to prevent an employee from making a workers' compensation claim if they can prove that they caught the virus on the job. I think that proof may be a little bit difficult, but workers' comp is still out there. And that's not going to prevent OSHA from coming to knock on our door to determine whether we've been satisfying our safety obligations. But for your basic civil liability, employers are now immune unless the employer has acted recklessly or engaged in intentional conduct. So this gets back to, again, complying with those safety requirements, because it certainly would be an argument that if we're not complying with basic safety requirements, that would be considered reckless behavior. So those are sort of the general questions that we've been seeing on our end from companies related to returning employees to work.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm going to bring in Kathy Armbruster now. Kathy, you've had a number of clients that you've worked hands-on with trying to help employees come back to the workforce, but also wrestling with some of those important pieces of legislation that have been passed recently. And some of these need to be considered. So I'll pop up a new screen here and perhaps you can cover some of those.
Sure. I think there was a comment, Scott, that there was maybe kind of a pop down that was in the way of some of the verbiage on the slide. So I don't there we go. So I'm going to cover a little bit on the legislative updates. So initially, many of you might be familiar with the FFCRA, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, was enacted last year. And the spirit and the purpose of it was to provide a financial lift to employees, but also to provide a bit of a buffer for employers when the question first surfaced of what are we going to do if people are not able to work, either because they are ill, they need to care for someone who is ill, they have to quarantine, or they have to care for someone who is in quarantine and not able to care for themselves. So the legislation passed, and it provided that buffer for folks, the pay for up to 10 days of pay for those who fall under those categories. And really, they put that in place through the end of December. Of course, like all things at the time, thinking that's plenty of time. We might be through the woods by then and have no need for it after that point. However, come the middle of December, as things were being reevaluated, there was an extension on it, but some changes to it at that time. So the changes at that time were to provide it as optional for employers, that it was not required for employers to have to pay anymore. So that was one option. The other was that there were still the tax credits available to employers if they opted in. Very important, that's that employer buffer, right? So they're going to pay their employees while they're out, they receive a tax credit so that it's net neutral. And I think employers caught on to this pretty quickly. It was maybe the employees who didn't understand it quite as fast and really needed the help of their HR department and communication throughout the organization on how they were going to handle that. So now fast forward, here we are coming up on April 1, another extension for the FFCRA, and this falls under the new American Rescue Plan Act that was enacted in March. So come April 1, the extension is still out there. We're now extended until the end of September, still optional for employers to decide whether or not they want to opt in. And a few new things, though, that are covered. In addition to those who may be ill with coronavirus, again, as we shift and we have a little bit of a light at the end of the tunnel, additional coverage now is for employees who are obtaining a vaccine or may have had a reaction to a vaccine. So the good news is that, there are add-ons to this legislation, but for good purpose. And we hope that as we go on through that June, July, August, and September, that the need for employers and employees to utilize this legislation will decrease. I've had a few of the employers that I work with a little hesitant to commit to their employees that they will participate in this plan all the way through September. And so we've done, just like the government has done, and just like we've done in other cases, we've said, all right, well then let's just put the stake a little bit further ahead. We don't have to commit to all the way until September. We can say that we're going to cover it through June, and then we'll reassess, reevaluate, and update everybody as we go along. And that seems to be palatable for employees at this point, and for the leadership of the groups that I've worked with. So, the buffer continues. Most employers that I know are continuing to opt in for it because, one, it's net neutral. Two, the employee relations part is very positive. And three, it protects those who have not yet been vaccinated so that people are not tempted to want to have to come to work to earn their pay if they're really not in a position to be able to do that. So all around, I think people are feeling pretty confident about this, and the changes that are made seem to make sense for the time. So I think that's appreciated by both employers and employees.
Thanks, Kathy. A lot of the role you play day to day is employee relations, how people are feeling, how they're doing with things. So kind of walk us through some of your observations as you've worked through that. And again, I hopefully have a slide here that'll walk through some of these things as well.
Yeah, thank you. So, you know, we said, as many of you experienced yourselves, the pivot to needing to figure out who can work from home. How will we manage that? Most people that I've talked to have said they figured it out pretty quickly. And yes, there were some bumps and technology and figuring out how to manage through that, but most people adapted. Now we're coming to the other end of the spectrum, and even as early as that August, September, the groups I worked with were starting to think about if they had people who it was optional, they could work at home, they could come back in the office. There was a little bit of a difference of opinion on, is it required to come back? Do people feel safe? Is it necessary to come back, right? Everybody adapted to working from home, and now there's consideration for coming back in. You know, when you see that poll, the question there about what are you looking forward to when you return to the office, and 20% of people polled said nothing. They were not looking forward to coming back at all. That was surprising to me. It makes me wonder a little bit about the work culture that's there. You know, a lot of people who want to come back have said, I miss who I work with. Maybe that's not the case for everybody. But, you know, I think in looking at that, it's beneficial to ask your employees, do they want to come back to work? How might you have to reframe and reconstruct what that will look like? Is it a hybrid model? Is it exclusively from home? And then really, I think, what's the rationale or what's the driver for someone wanting to come back to work or not wanting to come back to work? And can you manage that without cutting the pie 50 different ways and tailoring it to every single employee? Perhaps you would have you know, again, that wait and see kind of a mindset of, we'll try this for a while and then we'll figure it out and we'll work at it incrementally. But really going beyond what they think as to, and learning about the why, right? And some of the concerns that I've been hearing from employees, one, they think that they are more productive when they're at home. Conversely, you know, as Jerry had mentioned before, I also have another number of managers who, absent information, they're not always confident that their employees are more productive. And I think the answer to that is, well, then figure out what it is you need from your employees and how will you know if they're delivering, and then there's your answer, right? It's not easy to do always, but it's important to do it, especially as we have more and more employees who are saying, I don't want to go back. And for some people, that means they will go to an employer who has exclusive work from home or very rare in the office. So I think it's important to gauge how significant is that to your folks and what do you want to do about it? So under the concerns, for some people currently, I think it is the COVID vaccine is a concern. If they're going to be coming back to the office, what's their risk to being back? And is their employer going to require the vaccine? But then conversely, you know, 70% of employees want an employer to require a vaccine, but we're seeing maybe close to that rate in polls and questionnaires that I've seen, maybe that many who say that they will get the vaccine. So you want to require it of others, but maybe you're not necessarily willing to take it yourself. I'm not sure, but that's, I think, a question for a leadership team to think about a little bit, right? And then again, I had mentioned the exposure to others and productivity. I think in this time where in Wisconsin, at least about 25% of people have had one shot and they're still waiting on the other, this is particularly sensitive to think about wearing the masks and how you're going to manage through the employee relations aspect of that until you're at a point where you have critical mass of people and you're responding appropriately for those who have a higher level of concern.
Thanks, Kathy.
Sure.
Part of the reality we're facing right now is that the pandemic has created some tremendous stressors in both our employees and the employers' lives. I'd like to now turn to Jane Schroeder through her coaching experience, has some pretty unique insights into this area. So I'm going to stop sharing here for a second, Jane, just to pull up some of the data that you had provided, and you can start.
Okay, great. Thank you, Scott. Yeah, I wanted to take kind of a broad brush around the kinds of things that I'm hearing leaders talk about right now, and the things that are being that are surfacing in different articles and what have you. Pretty widespread. In fact, just yesterday, the Milwaukee Business Journal announced that they are going to be having a mental health in the workplace webinar in later April. And, you know, just the same line that I was speaking about here, that this mental health issues are a continuing trend. It certainly was an issue well before COVID, but COVID has certainly escalated the issues in many, many ways. According to a CDC survey, over 40% reported increased anxiety, depression, and substance abuse. Many people are stressed out and burnt out. And really, it's a result of the compounding stressors. You know, there's a little different mix for everybody out there, but most everyone has been affected in some shape, way, or form through COVID with additional stress. And you know, those compounding stressors, according to the American Psychological Association, which does actually, again, before COVID, they've been doing a Stress in America survey pretty consistently. And the most recent survey, 7 in 10 or 67% of those asked said they've had increased stress during the pandemic. So these are high numbers, and it's really talking about, you know, what's a leader, what's a manager, what's a business owner to do given that. And I think a couple of things, you know, most everything that I'm reading and hearing from individuals is that more than ever, because of the widespread nature of this, the leader's role and obligation is really to demonstrate compassion, you know, make time to listen and understand those unique needs. And I had access to some of the work that Deloitte is doing internally through actually my daughter, who is employed there. And she shared some of the things that they are doing to just focus on this. And I think, you know, the reality that leaders are going to have just by the sheer numbers, more incidents of employees coming to them with mental health issues. And so, you know, for any leader, business owner, what have you out there is just to try and be as prepared for that as possible by knowing what the resources are, by giving an atmosphere of accessibility and, you know, a tone of safety, psychological safety for someone to be able to address those concerns. And know your own internal process. You know, if you have a policy, if now is time to create a policy, but at any rate, know what those are, because if we are thinking about some employees coming back, and even remotely, obviously, as things continue to change, being prepared to address that is going to be important.
Good. So I think we pretty well covered all these things. Apologize for being off a little bit on the slides here. So Jerry, as we're going to think about these things now and moving forward, I know culture is very important to you at Arrow. And as you again wrestle with some of the issues in terms of how to deal with cultural issues and how to show compassion and just how to deal with these different factors out there. Now you actually had shared some of your questions with me, and I kind of want to open this up to the group a little bit and obviously open it up to any chat questions that come through. But these are some of the questions I know, Jerry, you've been wrestling with, and why don't we kind of work our way through these? And I think one of the first is, you know, how do you make sure that there's a balance there, right, in between how people feel about what they're doing?
Absolutely. So Scott, as you know, how do you want people to submit questions? Because, you know, as Jane and Kathy have been going, and Chris have been going through stuff. As I have questions, I'm writing them down here. How do you want people to submit questions for the end?
in the chat there. That'll come, they can put it in the chat. The Q&A up there actually is the way to do it. And Jerry, you always have great questions, so feel free to ask away yourself.
And that's what I loved Jane's that she was just saying, because compassion is is somewhat of a subjective term. We're trying to ask our employees for input, but after discussion with managers, but there's a certain sense that this is a right rather than a benefit, that it's not necessarily the company's choice of whether or not I work remotely. To me, they're trying to twist that a little bit to be, I have a right to work from home, where it might happen that I have kids that I don't have to pay for daycare then as well. So we're dealing with a lot of fairness questions. One department can work from home effectively. Another one, our customer service department, where in our case, we've got product that they constantly go and look at to answer questions. They don't have that at home. So why does sales get to work from home and customer service doesn't get to? Culture, that was interesting. That 20% said there's nothing they're looking forward to coming back for. We value culture a lot. And how do you when you get new employees, if you don't ever have them come in the office, how do you ingrain that culture? So we've started to require that all new Wisconsin-based employees have to be in the office for 90 days at least. After that time, we'll consider whether or not. So even through the interview process, we're explaining we've got a remote work policy, but the first 90 days you have to be in the office full time. So you can get training, and we can also ingrain the culture. We're running into questions on office space now that we have people everybody's always used to having their own office space where they have their picture of their kids and their trinkets that are there. Well, now all of a sudden you're only coming in 1 day a week. I don't want to have an office that you're going to use 1 day a week. Well, now asking a long-term employee to suddenly share their office with somebody else is a challenge. So we're trying to present it that this is a benefit. If you want to work from home, you better figure out how to share your office. If not, you're welcome to come in the office 5 days a week. We're there. You can do it. But those are the type of objections. And it seems that we all know somebody who wants to open up everything right now. And then the other side of the coin, that 70% who want everybody to be vaccinated, sometimes they tend to be a little bit meeker. So what we've found is that the responsible solution is to have reasonable guidelines. So we've already said even if the governor comes out and says the mask mandate is gone, like they've done in Texas and Mississippi, we have a mask mandate in the office until Memorial Day. We have a requirement in the conference room. No, we have opened the conference room, but only up to 4 people through Memorial Day. Then we'll look at it that anything larger, you have to have Zoom. And then we are leaving it up to dealer employee discretion of whether they are comfortable going out for dealer visits or lunches and things like that.
Kathy, any of these things pop up in your world as you've wrestled with these issues? I think you're muted right now, Kathy.
You'd think after all this time I could get the unmute on better. Yes, we've had the same thing, and in particular, one of the locations, I'll give you an example, is in Washington County that I support, and the county executive there just came out and said that they are no longer going to enforce any COVID-related mandates. And so, of course, even before we had employees ask the question, the leadership team came out and said, no, we're all locations will be the same. This is how we're going to manage through it. So I think that's been, they've been very clear on what their thoughts are, and yet they're always trying to look a step or two ahead to figure out what next.
Interesting.
And Scott, could I chime in here on a?
Yep, please do, Jennifer. Yep.
One is that companies have to remember, and Jerry and his company are doing it absolutely correctly with this mask mandate thing, that OSHA is still requiring or suggesting that companies require their employees to wear masks. And so OSHA is going to consider that a safety issue, irrespective of what your state government says about it. So I would be a little hesitant as an employer to ignore OSHA just because the governor does or doesn't say what we should or shouldn't do. And so that's why Jerry's company is doing it correctly, because they're saying, we believe at least until May, irrespective of whatever Governor Evers decides, we're going to have the masks in place, and then we'll see what things look like then. And maybe, you know, the numbers will be way down where it's just not necessary anymore, but it's really a safety issue that we have to consider as employers. The other issue I wanted to comment on was this fairness issue, because this comes up as a legal issue in discrimination claims. So, and Jerry again is right that, you know, many employees are now viewing this as a right, viewing working from home as a right and a benefit. Surprisingly, some employees don't view it as a benefit and would prefer to work in the office. And so you're going to be dealing with, you know, a whole range of feelings about people who are working at home who'd rather be in the office, and people who are working in the office who would rather be working at home. And we really have to make sure that we're treating people consistently depending on what the nature of their work actually requires, because otherwise we're going to open ourselves up to a discrimination complaint. And so the decision as to whether employees should be allowed to continue to work remotely will be dictated by the needs of the business and whether those needs can be satisfied either full-time or part-time by a remote working arrangement. And it's obvious there's certain jobs that just can't be done remotely. You know, if you have a manufacturing facility, people need to be on the line working. So those things are obvious, but we're allowed to treat different positions differently. So we can treat the manufacturing people differently than the office people, and that would not be discriminatory because we have a legitimate reason for treating them differently. But we always have to be concerned about discrimination complaints if we're treating two employees who appear to be similar in terms of their job requirements, and we're treating them differently with respect to a perceived benefit.
I think if I can jump in on that, Jennifer, one of the things that we've done is we've said, what are the criteria that we're using to evaluate whether or not this should be an in person or at home? It's helpful because then managers know before they give an answer, am I really checking this against the criteria? And two, employees have an idea of what is it that the company is using to make that decision. And so in some cases, the answer's out there before they don't even have to ask because they understand what the criteria is for the decision.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to do that. And then we can always use those criteria if we're ever having to explain to employees or defend any kind of complaint. So, right.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Jennifer, I was going to ask the question, so as an employer now,
Yes.
Is there ever a, let's say somebody doesn't want to have anybody work remote, even though they may have worked remote for the past year. They want to say, nope, everybody's going to come back in. Is there ever an occasion where that is a right? I'm fearful. I'm still fearful of coming back in. If I get away from the fairness issue, just overall as a company policy, can I say, effective June 1st, we're open for business and you need to be here? Is that legal?
Yes, it absolutely is legal. The only people that you'll need to consider is those people who have a disability that prevents them from working in the office. And even then, the remote working arrangement is not necessarily a reasonable accommodation. It may be for the duration of a period of time where we're concerned about exposure, but I think when we come to the point where a large percentage of the population is vaccinated, whether this employee is or isn't, I think they no longer will have the ability to claim that they need to work at home to avoid the COVID. So even though we may have been allowing employees to work at home for the past year, that we were really doing that as a temporary measure to address an emergency and strange, situation. It didn't mean that we were altering our job. The job is at the office. The employer has the right to make that decision and impose it. And if employees don't agree with that, then they have a right to choose an employer that does. So then you're going to get into Kathy and Jane's issues about how are we dealing with morale issues associated with that decision. But the legal answer is you can absolutely require all employees to be back at the workplace.
Okay, let me ask a follow-up on that then. This goes back to the vaccine. We are drafting a policy for travel that if you don't have the vaccine, you can't travel. Expecting that some airlines are going to be requiring that.
Right.
Are we okay in that?
Yeah, I think that is legitimate because you're not mandating the vaccine itself. You're just saying that really for safety purposes, these are the conditions under which you have to perform your job. So that would be legitimate. And you're right, it's going to be, interesting to see how the airlines, how different countries are already, talking about the COVID passports and those types of things. So yeah, we definitely can do that.
Thanks.
Jane, something that Jerry had raised as one of the questions was the conference room, and you shared something in our pre-session that I thought was interesting about team dynamics and communication. Share that story. It was very interesting because I think it's an aspect or a viewpoint that's worth thinking through.
Yes, it was really interesting because when I do team facilitation, my preference always is to be in the same room with people. And obviously, over the last year, that hasn't been possible. And for the first time in all that time, a team asked me a couple of weeks ago to come in and facilitate this particular meeting in person. And I was very excited to do so. It's been a long time. And so I got there, and of course, we were in a big conference room and everyone was masked. And it was a very, very challenging and difficult experience for me, and I was not anticipating it. So a couple of the factors that contributed to that were that first, I couldn't hear everyone through the mask, which was difficult. We were having a difficult conversation, and I could not read the facial gestures and the expressions. And that is so much part of the facilitation process, particularly around a crucial conversation. And I felt at such a disadvantage. And I was really quite shocked at the impact that had. And so I have to say that at this moment, as long as masks are still required, I would much prefer to Zoom, because I am able, just like right now, we can read each other's facial expressions. We can get a sense of where people are at. And that is such a huge part of the communication that was a very interesting learning experience.
One of the earlier concepts I threw out there at the beginning was the hybrid model. I'll share some stories from our own staff meetings when at Lauber, we try to do this hybrid between a Zoom and in person. And I think you've all seen how inept I am running Zoom and PowerPoints here today already. I mean, it just does not work well. And at some point, I guess we just got to figure it out, and hopefully we all do. But that's one of those practical scratch your heads going, okay, how do we do this right to make sure we're having good team communication and working through things like that? So that's something we've had to live with. Kathy, listening to—
Sorry, Scott.
Yeah,
I'm sorry,
ahead,
Scott.
Jerry.
I'm going to add to what Jane was saying, though. What we've also learned is that hybrid model is unfair. It's funny because, Jane, when you're saying, hey, Zoom is better because you can see faces, you can read everything, but it's unfair to people on Zoom when you do have people inside a conference room, because they're kind of the outsider. You're always saying, I find it's better either if anybody is on Zoom, now that we're comfortable with it, generally, it's easier for everybody to be on Zoom. That puts everybody on the same playing field versus 4 of us are in a conference room and 2 people are remote. They have a much harder time participating in the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree.
A little earlier, Jennifer gave us the legal point of view on the fairness, and Jerry raised the question, but to transition that into being an attractive employer, Kathy, as you think through your clients, and once again, you look at the labor unemployment rates are already coming down rapidly, and I think we're going to quickly switch back into having to work hard to find good employees. How do we deal with this now when the expectation of employees may be, especially I'm thinking like IT professionals and people like that, they might not ever want to come back, and how do we deal with that as employers?
They may not, and I think as much as we've said, lay out the criteria for that decision, we've also had to challenge ourselves, and I've had to challenge some of the managers that I work with when they say this position just won't work here if it's not physically in person. And every now and then I get one of them to say, well, maybe I'm not thinking that through right. And so I think it's also being willing to challenge ourselves to say, is it really important to have someone on site, or are we just used to it? And we found that we had to figure out how to make it work. Maybe the next step is figuring out how to make it work optimally, and kind of changing our mindset to, if I have to make this work well, what would I do differently? But I think it's going to be here to stay. And I think you rather than just say, I'll accept it, it might be, and then how will I make this a very positive and enriching, and how will I make it work for us? You know, the idea that now your talent pool is expanded across the United States, not just in your neighborhood, can really be freeing, but you also have to be ready to make sure that you keep that person engaged and make them feel part of the organization. And I don't think everybody's had to do that quite yet. You know, Jerry had said to have employees that he hasn't met yet in person, that's a big change of how do you make someone feel welcome and part of the culture if they're not physically there. I think we just have to figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
And if we're going to be having employees who are working remotely from another state, we're going to have to make sure we're complying with that state's employment laws as well. And there may be certain tax implications, which is, you know, a little beyond the scope of this, but we do have to make sure that, you know, that's a red flag for us. If we have somebody out of state, you know, the employer will have to follow up to make sure they're satisfying all their obligations.
Yeah.
Jennifer, keep on that path, please, which is the whole wage, you know, fair wage in terms of some of the ramifications there. Now that we have these remote hourly employees, for instance, how do we gauge them? What can we do? And then that whole salary versus, you know, when is the clock on? When is it off? Help sort through that a little bit for us.
So assuming the employees are truly not exempt from the overtime laws, we pay them by the hour. The employer is obligated to pay them for all time worked, and to pay them for all time that the standard is, did the employer suffer or permit the work? Meaning, do we know that they're actually doing the work? So that's harder to monitor when somebody's working remotely. So when somebody's working remotely, the basic thing the employer should do, and the Department of Labor has come out and said this is okay, is make sure you know what the schedule is going to be. And as long as you don't have any knowledge that the employee is working outside the schedule, you have expectations of policy that they're going to write down the time work, that they're going to work the time that's their schedule, then if they did happen to work outside that schedule, you didn't know about it, then you're not going to have to pay for that time. But if you do know about it, and that's going to come up if, say, I'm the boss and I'm the one who's on the phone with the employee, you know, after hours, I know that that person is working, then I've got an obligation to make sure that that time is properly recorded. It also becomes an issue when employees are working flexible schedules. And so we've seen this with people, especially who have childcare. So maybe they'll get up early and work from 6 to 9 and then from 4:30 till 7:30 at night. And the normal rule in wage payment rules is that you have to pay an employee from the time they begin work till the time they end work. But in that scenario, they have a huge chunk of the day where they're not actually working because they're taking care of the kids or helping them with their schooling. And so again, it gets back to the agreed upon schedule. So then the Department of Labor again says you're entitled to just pay the employee for those hours they're actually working and not that space in between. So you want to make sure you have really good understanding with the employees about, you know, what's the time that they're working remotely. And this is going to apply if you have an employee who's in a hybrid model, who's working part-time at the office, where we can pay attention to their hours, and part-time at home. Those hours at home should be relative to a schedule. If the employee is truly exempt from the overtime laws, we pay them a salary and they perform exempt duties like a manager, then we really don't have to worry about the hours because they get paid a salary for no matter what hours they work. And so we don't have to worry about that as much. We just have to make sure they truly are exempt.
Gene, I know
Jennifer.
Oh, go ahead.
Jennifer, clarify that. Is the rule of used to be, my understanding was always was from the time you begin work until you end work.
Right.
The OSHA ruling on that, is that an exception because of COVID, or is that an ongoing rule now?
It's an exception specifically because of COVID. The Department of Labor understands that there are many people working a model now where they're not working consecutive hours or contiguous hours. And so they've allowed the employer to say, I'm only going to pay you from, 7:30 to 9:30 and then 4:30 to 7:30 and not the time in between, as long as that's the agreed upon schedule. So it is important to have that schedule. So you're right. It's just an exception for COVID. It's not anticipated that that's going to stay around. And I don't know at what point the Department of Labor says, okay, we're done now. So, but I think for at least the near term, I think we can continue to do that while employees are working these schedules where the kids aren't back at school yet. The parents have to be home. They have a reason for doing that.
Jane, as I listen to this, I know one of the things you're passionate about is emotional intelligence. And I think about the need for leaders you touched on it a little bit before, but any just good insights for us? And obviously we don't have a ton of time here, and I know you have courses based upon this, but just kind of insights as leaders that we can try to put those, emotionally intelligent hats firmly on our head.
Well, the thing that comes to mind, Scott, is really, the new wave of expectations. Kathy touched on this a bit ago, and I think employees are coming back to the workplace if that is the decision, or some juggling, some new discussion about what work is going to look like. And many people have taken this COVID time to reevaluate their life priorities, their values, really identify what's important to them. And so I think in some cases, the issue of coming back to work or not is more of a work-life integration issue, not in every case. But, certainly a fair amount of people are looking at it that way. And, leaders, on the other hand, have shifted their expectations some because they've really experienced kind of a myth buster of, presence equals productivity, not necessarily, right? And so I think it really is, a matter of everybody just coming, to conversation with acceptance of that we're all different. There have been so many articles that I have scanned in preparation for this today, and the vast majority, one was even titled, we are not the same as we were before COVID. And I think that's really true in so many different ways. And just really taking the time to recognize that and to really engage in good communication about what that means for people. And, as a business owner, that sounds, I'm sure, a little daunting, but I think, just to the degree that it's possible, to really get a sense of where people are at. So communication is the bottom line. Yeah.
And I would, and I'd reiterate that, towards the question of how have we changed the way we lead our employees. I don't think it's changed. I think it just is a reminder, sometimes we get lazy as leaders. We think we know what employees need and want, and we guide that. And I think this is a great wake-up call for us to say, even if we might have known before, we don't know now. So it's asking a lot more questions of, I've wanted to get a culture committee set up in my company, but finally did it because so many things have changed. I know my kids are grown and I have grandkids. I can't relate to what families might need that now are dealing with kids that haven't been in school for a year. And even when they go back to school, there are going to be issues and all the different things. We got to communicate with them. We got to talk to them more and more. It still is always hard getting information out of them. You ask them a question, they don't just say, oh yeah, here's exactly what we need. Right. But at least you can sleep at night knowing that you're giving people the opportunity to provide the feedback on what they need.
One of the things, Jennifer, here, as we kind of wrap down, this is a little bit of a nit, but as we talk about weaving the home life and the business life together, the practicality of tools, computers and things like that comes to mind. And I know I attended a session the other day about security and viruses and things you have to be careful. Is there any quick tips you can offer there in terms of what we can or shouldn't be doing in that area as employers?
Yeah, so the employer cannot require the employee to pay the expenses of them doing the work at home if that would diminish their wages below minimum wage. And so what that means is if the employee needs a computer to do their work, the employer is going to have to provide that. The employer, most everybody now has their own cell phone, so the employee can use their own cell phone, and then we're going to have them comply with our policies about security and confidentiality and those types of things. But so the employer generally has to keep in mind that, there's some big expenses that's probably going to be the employer's expense. If the employer is the one that really is sort of requiring or allowing the work from home, if it's just the employee's choice, if the employee has a choice to be in the office or at home, then the employer really doesn't have that obligation.
Gotcha. Well, we're kind of running out of time here, and there's so much more we could probably talk about. So if we could just do a quick wrap up from each of us. So Jerry, any quick just thoughts that come to mind as we kind of walk away from this right now?
I think the biggest one is be looking 6 weeks, 2 months, 6 months out. Be aware if there's another surge that starts coming, it doesn't sneak up on us. This didn't sneak up on us in March if we were paying attention. Pay attention to what's going on, and so you're prepared when it happens. And that's the best advice I've got, and what has served us very, very well to figure out how to keep going forward.
Good, thank you. Kathy? Oh, microphone.
Got it. Just keep up on your reading list because things change, and not easy always to anticipate the labor laws that are going to change. One thing I failed to mention before that I wanted to bring up, speaking of things that change, is with the latest act on April 1st, in addition to employers being able to voluntarily participate, there is a requirement on COBRA premiums for employees that you have termed. So it won't go into big detail, but for those of you who say, wait a minute, I've got some employees that we're terming in the near term or maybe even recently, do some quick reading on the COBRA premium requirement. That's about it for right now for me. Thanks.
And Jane?
I have a couple resources that I would recommend. One was a really fascinating article by a woman who led a 12-month expedition into the Antarctic. And she has some interesting insights to share about what it feels like to be coming out of isolation as a leader and some things to be paying attention to. So I think we've got the participant list. I will be happy to, email a link out to everyone for that. And there's also a very cool book called Leading from Anywhere, which is by David Burkus. I will also send this as a reference, but it's an essential guide to managing remote teams. So no matter which way you decide to go, there's some good just insights there. So I'll send those along.
And Jennifer?
Yeah, and I agree with Kathy 100%. Is things are changing so rapidly. They have changed over the past year and they'll continue to change for a while, that employers really have to stay on top of all the latest legal developments. And sometimes it's hard to get completely accurate information. So don't make a decision just off the cuff. Just make sure you're stopping and being deliberate and thinking about what you're doing before you do it.
Good. I'd like to thank all of you as panelists, and we purposely went kind of all over the board here. So if there are any other questions from anybody that have went unanswered or you're interested, please reach out to us at Lauber. Be happy to put any of these wonderful people in touch with you. We'll also have a copy of this webinar available, as well as we'll get some of the resources that Jane had mentioned. And again, on behalf of Lauber Business Partners, and we'd like to thank all the panelists and also all the members of the audience for joining us. So have a great evening and take care.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye all.
Bye, everyone.